All right, so we're going to go over chapter 23. And chapter 23 can be a bit dense for some students just because there's going to be kind of slow progress and there's a lot of conversation um, kind of revolving around the missionary circle that in Alexandria requires Scout to be a part of. So we'll break down that bit as we go through the chapter. It begins with this scene where Mr. Yule spits on Atticus, and it makes clear that this isn't over. The trial is over, the case has been closed, but there are still going to be people in town, obviously the Yules, who continue to persecute Atticus for the choices that he made to defend Tom Robinson and his accusations leveled at the Yule family in particular. So Atticus had been spit upon, and Jem and I didn't think it was entertaining. After all, though, I said, he was the deadest shot in the county at one time. He could, he wouldn't carry a gun, Scout. He ain't even got one, said Jem. He didn't even have one down at the jail that night. He told me having a gun around is an invitation to somebody to shoot you. Well, that's different, but we could ask him to borrow one. We did, and he said nonsense. So not only is he being spit on, but there is a threat to his life that was issued in more than one occasion. And so the kids are like, well, why won't you do something about it? So Dill was of the opinion, to appeal to Atticus's better nature. We would starve if Mr. Yule killed him, besides being raised exclusively by Aunt Alexandra, and we all knew the first thing that she would do before Atticus was under the ground would be to fire Calpurnia. Jem said it might work if I cried and I flung a bit, being a young and a girl, but that didn't work. When he noticed us dragging around the neighborhood, not eating, taking little interest in our normal pursuits, Atticus discovered how deeply frightened we were. He tempted Jem with a new football magazine one night, and when we saw him flip the pages and toss it aside, he said, "What's bothering you, son?" Jem came to the point. "Mr. Yule, what's happened?" "Nothing. We're scared for you. We think you ought to do something about him." Atticus smiled. "Do what? Put him under a peace bond? When a man says he's going to get you, looks like he means it." Well, he meant it when he said it. Jem, see if you can stand in Bob Yule's shoes a minute. If you're looking for how Atticus is the same, he goes back to that same principle that he claimed at the beginning of the book during a kind of a peaceful moment when he didn't have any enemies. Now that his life is threatened, he still maintains you need to stand in someone else's shoes or get in somebody else's skin. He says, I destroyed his last shred of credibility at that trial. If he had any to begin with. The man had to have some kind of a comeback. His kind always does. So spitting in my face and threatening me, save Mayella one extra beating, that's something I'd gladly take. He had to take it out on somebody, and I'd rather it be on me than that house full of children. You understand? Jem nodded. Alexandra entered the room, and Atticus was saying, we don't have anything to fear from Bob Yule. He got it all out of his system that morning. I wouldn't be so sure of that, Atticus, she said. His kind to do anything to pay off a grudge, and you know how those people are. What on earth could Yule do to me, sister? Something furtive. You may count on that. Nobody has much chance to be furtive and make 'em. And after that, we weren't afraid. Summer was melting away. We made the most of it. So they're going to talk about the trial. It doesn't get appealed for quite some time. And so he's trying to get it pushed outside of the state of Alabama because he says nobody in Alabama is going to acquit him. And so they talk about a man being sentenced for murder. Also rape in that county was punishable by death. And so lots of folks have been hung or hanged on circumstantial evidence, said Jem. I know a lot of them probably deserved it, but the absence of an eyewitness, there's always a doubt. Sometimes only the shadow of a doubt. The law says reasonable doubt, but I think a defendant's entitled to the shadow of a doubt. There's always a possibility, no matter how improbable, that he's innocent. Then it all goes back to the jury then, and we ought to do away with juries, Jem was saying. Atticus tried hard not to smile. You're rather hard on us, son. I think maybe there might be a better way. Change the law. Change it so that only judges have the power to fix the penalty in capital cases. Then go to Montgomery and change the law. You'd be surprised how hard that would be. I won't live to see the law changed, and if you live to see it, you'll be an old man. That wasn't good enough for Jem. No, sir, they ought to do away with juries. He wasn't guilty in the first place, and they say he was. If you had been on that jury, son, and 11 other boys like you, Tom would be a free man. So far, nothing in your life has interfered with your reasoning processes. Those are 12 reasonable men in everyday life, Tom's jury, but you saw something come between them and reason. You saw the same thing that night in front of the jail. When the crew went away, they didn't go as reasonable men. They went there because we were there. There's something in our world that makes men lose their heads. They couldn't be fair if they tried. In our courts, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. So, interestingly enough, the reason that he says that this happened is that something came between men and reason. I wanted to point that out because it is applicable as a theme, not because it's not just true in this text, but it's true somewhat universally that human beings who make foolish or unjust decisions are not acting reasonably and rationally. There's something that comes between them and reason, and in this case it's prejudice. Other times it might be fear, other times it might be anger, but when people act based on emotion or based upon what society would deem right, they're not putting logic and truth kind of at the forefront of their mind. And that's what Atticus is arguing. So kind of challenging you to think about, where does that happen in other places as well? It doesn't make it right, said Jim. He beat his fist on his knee. You can't just convict a man on evidence like that. You can't. You couldn't, but they could and did. And the older you grow, the more of it you'll see. The only place where man ought to get a square deal is in a courtroom, be he any color of the rainbow, but people have a way of carrying their resentments right to a jury box. And as you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't forget it. Whenever a white man does that to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he comes from, that white man is trash. Atticus was speaking so quietly. His last word crashed on our ears, and I looked up. His face was vehement. There's nothing more sickening to me than a low-grade white man who will take advantage of a man's ignorance. Don't fool yourselves. It's all adding up, and one of these days, we're going to pay the bill for it. And I hope it's not in your children's time. Jim was scratching his head. Atticus, why don't people like us and Miss Maudie ever sit on juries? You never see anybody from Macomb on a jury. They all come from in the woods. Atticus leaned back. I was wondering when that would occur to you. There are lots of reasons. For one thing, Miss Maudie can't serve on a jury because she's a woman. You mean women in Alabama can't? I was indignant. I do. Guess it's to protect our frail ladies from sordid cases like Tom's. Besides, Atticus grinned, I doubt if we'd ever get a complete case tried. The ladies would be interrupting to ask questions, and Jem and I laughed. Miss Maudie on a jury would be impressive. I thought of old Mrs. DeBose in her wheelchair. Stop that rapping, John Taylor. I want to ask the man something. Perhaps our forefathers were wise. So that's a little bit of the hint at feminism and stereotyping. With people like us, that's our share of the bill. We generally get the juries we deserve. Our stout Macomb citizens are not interested in the first place, and in the second place, they're afraid. Then they're afraid why? Well, what if Mr. Link Dees had decided the amount of damages to award, say, Miss Maudie when Miss Rachel ran over her car? Link wouldn't like the thought of losing either lady's business at his store, would he? So he tells Judge Taylor he can't serve on a jury because he doesn't have anybody to keep store for him when he's gone. So Judge Taylor excuses him, and sometimes he excuses him wrathfully. What would make him think either one of them would stop trading with him, I asked. Miss Rachel would. Miss Maudie wouldn't. But a jury's vote's secret, Atticus. Our father chuckled. You've many more miles to go, son. A jury's vote's supposed to be secret. Serving on a jury forces a man to make up his mind and declare himself about something. Men don't like to do that. Sometimes it's unpleasant. Another comment here. So, he says that people don't like to be on a jury because of the consequence that will come to them as a result of being on the jury, especially if you have to weigh in against one or other of the people that you know. The second thing to note is that men don't like to be on juries because they don't like to make up their minds about something that might put you on one side or another. We prefer to stay neutral and out of conflict, but sometimes being on a jury, you have to make a decision that's going to be unpopular. And so people avoid it, kind of like the ostrich mentality of sticking your head in the sand, you don't have to deal with it. And that's what Atticus is sort of criticizing. And that is a human tendency. So Tom's jury sure made up its mind in a hurry, Jem muttered. Atticus's fingers went to his watch pocket. No, it didn't, he said. That was the one thing that made me think, well, this may be the shadow of a beginning. The jury took a few hours. An inevitable verdict, maybe, but usually it takes them just a few minutes, and this time, he broke off and looked at us. You might like to know that there was one fellow who took considerable wearing down. In the beginning, he was raring for an outright acquittal. Who? Jem was astonished, and Atticus's eyes twinkled. It's not for me to say, but I'll tell you this much. He was one of your old Sarum friends. One of the Cunninghams? Jem yelped. I didn't recognize any of them. You're joking. He looked at Atticus. One of their connections. On a hunch. I didn't strike him. Just on a hunch. Could have, but I didn't. Golly Moses, Jem said. 1 minute they're trying to kill him, and the next they're trying to turn him loose? I'll never understand those folks as long as I live. Atticus said you just had to know him. He said the Cunninghams hadn't taken anything from or off of anybody since they migrated to the New World. And the other thing about them was once you earned their respect, they were there for you tooth and nail. Atticus said he had a feeling, nothing more than a suspicion, that they'd left the jail that night with considerable respect for the Finches. Then, too, he said it took a thunderbolt plus another Cunningham to make one of them change his mind. If we'd had 2 of that crowd, we'd have had a hung jury. Jem said slowly, You mean you actually put on the jury a man who wanted to kill you the night before? How could you take such a risk, Atticus? When you analyze it, there was little risk. There's no difference between one man who was going to convict another man who's going to convict, is there? There's a difference between a man who's going to convict and a man who's a little disturbed in his mind, isn't there? He was the only uncertainty on the whole list. What kin was that man to Mr. Walter Cunningham? I asked. He picked it up. Let's see now. Double first cousin. Well, how can that be? 2 sisters married 2 brothers. That's all I'll tell you. You figure it out. I tortured myself and decided that if I married Jem and Dill had a sister whom he married, our children would be double first cousins. Oh, gee, Minnie, Jem, I said when Atticus had gone, they're funny folks. Did you hear that? Aunt Alexandra was hooking a rug. I heard it, she said. I remembered the distant, disastrous occasion when I rushed to Walter Cunningham's defense. Now I was glad I had done it. Soon as school starts, I'm going to ask Walter home to dinner. He can stay over sometimes after school, too. Atticus can drive him back to Old Sarum, and maybe he could spend the night with us sometime, okay, Jem? We'll see about that, Alexandra said. Why not? They're good folks. Jean Louise, there's no doubt in my mind they're good folks, but they're not our kind of folks. She means they're yappy, Scout. What's a yap? Oh, tacky, they like fiddling and stuff like that. Well, I do, too. Don't be silly, Jean Louise. That thing is, you can scrub Walter Cunningham till he shines, and you can put him in shoes and a new suit, but he'll never be like Jem. There's a drinking streak in that family. Finch women aren't interested in that sort of people. Auntie, she ain't 9 yet. She may well as learn it now. Well, Aunt Alexandra had spoken. It didn't say not to be nice to him. You should be friendly and polite. You should be gracious. But what if he was kin to us, Auntie? The fact is, he is not. But if he were, my answer would be the same. Oh, that's your father all over again, said Aunt Alexandra. And I'd say that Jean Louise will not invite Walter Cunningham to this house. If he were her double first cousin once removed, he would still not be invited. Now that is that. But I want to play with Walter, Auntie. Why can't I? I'll tell you why. Because he's trash. That's why you can't play with him. I am not going to have you around him picking up his habits and learning who knows what. You're enough of a problem as it is. It's all right, sir. Have a chew, Scout. Jem dug into his pocket and took out a Tootsie Roll. I'll show you something if you won't tell anybody, I said. Well, what? You can't see it. No? Well, it's hair. Where? Right there. Jem had comforted me, so I said it looked lovely, but I didn't see anything. It's real nice, Jem. Under my arms, too, he said. Going out for football next year, Scout. Don't let Auntie aggravate you. You know she's not used to girls, leastways not girls like you. She's trying to make you a lady. Can't you take up sewing or something? No, she doesn't like me. That's all there is to it, and I don't care. It was her calling Walter Cunningham trash that got me going. That boy's not trash, Jem. He ain't like the Yules. So we'll pick up in the next one.